for that introduction. It's been an amazing weekend here. Probably too much fun. It's sort of hard to get back on task talking about sort of academic matters. But I'm really happy for the invitation, so thanks for coming out. A couple things at the outset. I should say first off that this is work that I'm doing jointly with Max Abrams, who just started out at Northeastern University. Really smart guy, so keep an eye out for him. And also, we'll mention the Minerva initiative that funded this research. They'd like us to say that as quickly and as often as possible. You can imagine in the current funding environment, they feel like they're always about 2 minutes away from getting the axe. So they were part of that. And then finally, if you have questions as I go along, feel free to ask them. If it starts getting too out of hand, I might put things off to the end to make sure that we have enough time to get all the way through. But like the LBJ school, we have our share of economists, so we've gotten used to the idea that this is an active thing, and interruption is actually not the end of the world. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about this work that I've been doing on understanding variation in targeting choices by militant organizations. So what I want to begin with is sort of the basic problem that motivates this research agenda, and I think most research in this area, which is the problem of international terrorism, right? So this has been a captivating concern in American foreign policy since 9/11, and as you would expect, it spawned a huge academic literature looking at sort of the causes and consequences of terrorism, right? And what I want to sort of leave you with, hopefully today, is that there are some real flaws with thinking about terrorism as the object of a research agenda, right? And I think that by sort of changing some of the definitional issues, we might be able to get around some of those flaws. And a lot of this comes out of some definitional issues, right? So we could kind of go back and forth this entire session about what terrorism is, what the term means, what a good definition might be. I have no desire to do that whatsoever. What I do want to sort of make the case for is that there's usually two components to most definitions of terrorism, right? So there's the targeting of civilians for political ends, right? And what this does is it effectively mixes a tactic with an objective, right? So the idea is that you've got the tactical aspect of it, the targeting of civilians, you've got the objective aspect of it for political ends, and what this has done is it's caused people to think in terms of a strategic model of terrorism, right? So sort of implicitly, I think everyone kind of made this leap to the idea that organizations target civilians in order to achieve their political objectives, right? So this is sort of a causal relationship, or at least there's some intentionality there, right? The problem with that is that when people have sort of gone out and tried to match these two things up, they don't find a lot of support for it, all right? So the implication that people draw is that the tactic is seemingly at odds with the objective, right? Targeting civilians tends to set back political causes, and that leads us to sort of a model of terrorism and an explanation for terrorism that tends towards things like these are irrational actors, right? These people have apolitical motivations. And the end result of that, in turn, from a policy perspective, is the idea that certain tactical responses from a counterterrorism perspective are off the table, right? So something like deterrence isn't likely to be an effective strategy, right? Because we have this preconceived notion of what motivates terrorism. So what we have here is a long list of people who I have no intention, again, of going through, but what I want to demonstrate is sort of the extent to which this question of the productiveness of terrorism for political ends has sort of come to captivate the discussion of terrorism in general, all right? The issue is that perhaps this isn't really the right question at all. And that a better question might be something more along the lines of why do militant organizations target civilians, okay? So what we've done there is we've basically, well, first of all, I should say, militant organizations, in order to kind of pull out this selecting on the dependent variable component of things, right? So as soon as we're looking at just terrorist organizations and trying to understand terrorist behavior by looking at terrorist organizations, we've automatically put in both this political component and the targeting of civilians component, right? And we don't have anything to compare it against, right? So a number of people have brought this up as a potential problem, but then not a lot of people have turned around and sort of implemented the solution, okay? And there's I think, some pretty important reasons why we need to understand this variation, right? So first of all, terrorism can be perhaps politically counterproductive, but it's terribly common, right? And it's a pressing policy concern. So taking it off the table as something we want to understand the frequencies in doesn't make a ton of sense. Moreover, there's really important variation both between and within organizations over time in the extent to which they target civilians. So explanations like these groups have apolitical motivations, maybe it's something about religious groups, they're time invariant, right? They don't explain this, and therefore they're not particularly satisfying, right? So then the key distinction between the work we're doing here and the work that's already out there is that at the outset, we're agnostic about effectiveness. Okay? The question is not about whether terrorism works. All right? The question is simply what explains variations in frequency. Now, I want to sort of back up immediately and say this isn't sort of a University of Michigan Big Ten quantitative social science thing where we've taken the cool and interesting question and shucked it out the door in order to explain kind of boring variations in frequency. All right? It happens. You have to sort of put these caveats out there. By stepping back and sort of understanding this variation, I think we actually can speak much more effectively to this question of effectiveness, right? Why it is that we might observe this phenomenon coming out of these organizations, even if it turns out most of the time it's politically ineffective, all right? And the argument that's going to sort of get us there is the idea that there's a lot of heterogeneity in organizational structure, and that this in turn explains substantial variation in the frequency of indiscriminate violence. So in contrast to most work out there, which tends to look at the organization as the unit of analysis, right? These organizations actually are obviously comprised of individuals, and the structures that tie these individuals together vary a lot. All right, and this is sort of the important linkage that we're trying to draw out. And specifically, that groups with leadership deficits are going to tend to oversupply indiscriminate violence. All right? Now, I use the term oversupply here because I sort of want to emphasize that we're not making the case that it never makes sense to do this strategically, right? That the leaders at the top of organizations would always say that this isn't something we should employ tactically, right? It's that for a given organization, there's sort of a baseline rational provision of violence against civilians. And what we want to make the case is that for any given organization of that sort, we're going to see more violence out of them targeting civilians than we would if they had stronger leadership. All right, so when the leadership's weak, we see an additional increment of violence against civilians. All right? And the reason for it is that deficits exacerbate a basic principal agent problem within these organizations. Between more strategically minded leadership that is in fact motivated by these long-term political goals that I talked about at the outset, and foot soldiers who have generally been left out of the equation that actually have strong incentives to target civilians. Okay, so the bottom line is there's a mismatch in incentives within the organization, and the extent of leadership control dictates the extent to which the incentive structure of leadership prevails over the incentive structure of foot soldiers. All right, any questions? Okay. So let me just say a little bit more about the nature of this principal agent problem within these organizations. So in general, militant organizations tend towards decentralized structures, tend towards them when compared to things like that we're more accustomed to studying in the organizational studies literature, things like governments, things like corporations, things like militaries, right? So compared to that, they're all relatively decentralized. But there's a ton of variation within militant organizations as a class, right? And the reason for that is that they're facing sort of a constant trade-off, all right? They're trading off, strangely I think when we talk about sort of governments and we talk about militaries, we're pretty acceptant of the benefits of centralization, right? When we think about terrorist organizations, we tend to think about the benefits of decentralization. I think that's because we all have watched a fair bit of TV. We've seen our 24. We know that Jack Bauer fights cells, right? And so there's this sense that this is sort of the normal structure for these organizations, and a certain comfort with the idea that they do this for robustness and security, right? So you decentralize so that if you capture one group of people, you don't have the entire operation, right? You decentralize so that communication is more difficult to trace back to the middle of the organization, to the leadership. And that improves the robustness of your organization vis-a-vis counterterrorism measures, right? The key part of our analysis is that this is coming at a certain cost, right? And again, this comes straight out of the organizational literature. In other contexts like militaries, like governments, this is a pretty self-evident observation, but that it comes with the loss of principal control, loss of precision, and a loss of restraint. So a key part of this then is that incentives change with rank inside of these organizations. Leaders are generally more inclined towards long-term strategic and political objectives that favor restraint. This is because their status within the organization is derived in part from delivering on these longer-term goals, right? They are generally not in a position where they're relying on immediate predation in order to fund their day-to-day activities because they have access to core organizational resources, right? This stands, again, in direct contrast to the rank and file, which are generally embedded in a broader population. And then sort of key is this issue of time horizon. Right? So the way I like to think about this is that it's very difficult for these leaders to sort of go back to what it was before they were heads of these organizations. Right? So it's very difficult if you come to be the known head of a militant organization to go back to being a cobbler. Right? So in a different, totally different body of work, working with Al Stam's data on national level leaders, you see a lot of these guys come out of a rebel background, right? They're militant leaders to start with. And that's one outcome that you can get if you're one of these leaders. The more common outcome is actually that you end up dead, right? So it's sort of this deliver on political goals or fail catastrophically, right? So they're committed and have generally long time horizons. And then this stands in direct contrast to the rank and file who have generally mixed incentives and objectives, right? So they may care some about the political goals of the organization, the ideology, but they may also care about enriching themselves, right? They may also care about their reputation vis-a-vis peers, their position in the neighborhood, that sort of thing. They're operating in environments of resource scarcity, right? So they're generally self-funded, meaning that they are embedded in a group of people from whom they need to extract resources, and intimidating those people, killing those people, making sure that they punish those who rat them out, that sort of thing, can become incredibly important to their personal survival, right? And then again, this time horizon issue. So at the lower levels of the organization, people are fading in and out of the organization. Okay? They have generally short time horizons because going back to being a cobbler, or frankly more often going back to being a petty criminal, is on the table, right? And it remains on the table. The last assumption that we want to make is that incentives change with rank in the organization. So the idea here is not that these people are sort of born differently than these people, right? So that the rank and file are in some way mentally incapable, or even that they are systematically poor or systematically less educated and therefore aren't going to be able to ascend, right? Key to this story is the idea that you pick up the incentives of your station. Okay? And in real life, that we found a certain amount of evidence that can take some time, right? And so in additional work, we're looking at issues of leadership tenure and the extent to which that's a learning process. But for the sake of the story I'm telling you here, we're basically assuming that as you ascend within an organization, you pick up the relative incentives of that station. Okay? Okay. So to establish that proposition, we sort of found ourselves balancing between two central concerns. The first of these is the concern that this could be a pretty deeply endogenous relationship, right? So it could well be the case that, for example, organizations may decentralize in anticipation of targeting civilians, right? So they decide strategically that they want to target civilians, and they say, well, it would make an awful lot of sense to split up the organization, go into hiding before we sort of cause this inevitable response from the government, right? This counterterrorism response. It might be something totally unknown to us. There's some additional variable out there that causes both centralization and targeting, and we can't get at that. Okay? And then the second thing that we found ourselves pretty concerned with was generalizability. Right? Everything that I've told you so far is a pretty generic story about all militant organizations. Right? So we found ourselves pretty hard-pressed to find tests that would allow us to make such a grandiose claim, right? Across a lot of organizations, across time. All right? So the way we attack this is by sort of starting with the most general of our tests and sort of drilling down. All right? The first of these is a time series cross-sectional test on 100 militant organizations in the Middle East and North Africa over about 25 years. Right? So not perfect, not all regions, not all countries. People could have concerns about the process working very differently in Russia, that sort of thing. Not all years, obviously, but an important subset of years. Then we move on to unmanned aerial vehicle strikes in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And what's kind of cool about this is that we're able to use this as sort of a semi-exogenous treatment on leadership structure, right? So the timing of these of these strikes is unknown to leadership. So some of these concerns that I've talked about sort of decentralizing in anticipation of attacks are off the table here, okay? There are some other attributes of these tests that I'll talk about in a little bit. And then we did a detailed case study of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades in order to kind of pull out the causal mechanisms, make sure that the story that we're telling is indeed the one that's driving the finding. Every time I do that now, I worry about Ted Cruz. So let me say a little bit about the organizational analysis. The data that we're using here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this sort of stuff, so feel free to stop me and ask questions about the nature of the data and what we're doing. But this comes from the Minorities at Risk project, the Minorities at Risk organizational behavior data set. And as I said, 100 organizations, Middle East and North Africa, 1980 to 2004. All right? And what's cool about this, and what's not available anywhere else, and therefore why this makes for sort of our most general test, is that we've got data in here on both leadership decentralization or centralization, so the extent of the strength of leadership over foot soldiers, and organizational behavior, targeting of civilians, right? And people have had concerns over these data in the past. We've gone back and done as much as we could to sort of verify that we think that these codings are correct and corroborate it with other data. So we're pretty confident this is the case, but concerns over the minority at risk data are part of why we do the test sort of in multiple contexts, right? Why we move on to the UAVs, why we move on to the case study. So just to give you a sense of what we're looking for in these data, organizations with decentralized leadership are more likely to target civilians than organizations with more centralized leadership. So this is just sort of your basic naive hypothesis, right? The concern we have is that we don't have anything in this about whether the leaders are authorizing attacks on civilians, right? So like I said before, we don't want to fall into the trap of making the case that this never makes strategic sense, okay? So for example, if you're a ethno-nationalist organization, there could be some really good reasons to do some ethnic cleansing, to put some pressure on other minorities, things like that, right? So we don't want to say that that's never the case. So in order to deal with that, we interact the centralization with whether these leaders have ever made public statements authorizing the use of force against civilians, okay? It's not perfect. It's not perfect for a couple of reasons, right? First of all, it could be post hoc justification, right? They might be saying something along the lines of, can't stop these guys anyway, I may as well not look like a clown and just say that this is what I wanted all along, right? Compounding that, like I said before, this is yearly data, okay? Which means I can't even tell if the post hoc justification is like truly post hoc, right? It's happening after the attacks take place, not just anticipation of this loss of control, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. But still, I think it's better than the alternatives, all right? And the last thing I would say about that is, obviously, these are public statements, right? So there's a whole strategic element to this that we're not able to properly deal with. Again, part of the reason for the multiple venues for the testing. So organizations are least likely to target civilians when leaders are strong and do not publicly authorize civilian targeting. Organizations are most likely to target civilians when leaders are weak and publicly authorize civilian targeting. All right. Now I'm going to put up something here that you're going to hate and just ignore for a second. Oh, actually not yet. This is what you're going to hate. Okay. So the outcome here is civilian targeting. Okay. Explanatory variables, as I said, are this interaction variable. And then I'll touch on these in a minute. These are other measures that we tried to pull out in order to characterize centralization, but I'll deal with those separately. And then I just want to say a little bit about what it is that we're controlling for. So these are generally pretty standard, but age, size of the organization, whether they control territory, right? You might have coming out of the Civil War literature, there's a lot of, there's a sense that if you control territory, if you control population, you might be much more inclined to show some restraint than if you don't, right? The relative popularity of the organization, whether they have a propaganda arm, which is another indicator of overall capability that people have relied on. And then these key variables that I sort of already explained why they're pretty potentially important. Religious organizations have been cited as having particularly non-rational motivations. Ethno-nationalist organizations might have some really good strategic reasons to be doing this sort of thing. Okay? And given the structure of those organizations, those things might be related to the relative centralization of the organization as well. All right? State level control is, again, pretty standard. Population, education, GDP per capita, again, not of the organization, but of the state that it's embedded and operating in. Executive control. And then finally, whether there's ongoing conflict. Okay, and this is important because there's stuff out here that uses a similar logic that's about civil wars. Okay, so we'd want to be particularly concerned about the role that ongoing full-scale conflict in the society might have. That's not what this is that we're doing. So a very small percentage of our data, about 6% here, are Civil War observations. And everything that I'm going to show you sort of holds when that's out. All right, so the key distinction here is actually that we're not really telling you what happens inside of the context of civil wars. We've sort of left that to others. What we're telling you about is the behavior of militant organizations when there is not ongoing civil war. Okay, so this is here just to give you a sense of the structure of the analysis, not to show you anything about the coefficients. So we start with the naive hypothesis, just that simple organizational structure variable. Then we just add the interaction term, right? Then we add the organizational covariance, the state level covariance. And the reason we're doing that is we have some missingness in all of these observations, right? It doesn't look to be systematic, but we're kind of bleeding out observations as we go along. So we want to make sure that the findings sort of hold across those situations, all right? Then we play with some fixed effects here, but then key, we impute back in the missing observations, right? And so the point here is sort of, as you've picked up, kind of death by 1,000 cuts, right? We're gonna try to establish the robustness of this thing in a lot of different contexts because, again, data is not perfect. It's a difficult thing to pin down. This is a little bit more helpful, right? So what this is the probability of civilian targeting. On the left-hand side, you have that probability. And then you have weak organizations that authorize the use of force against civilians, strong organizations that authorize the use of force against civilians, weak don't authorize, strong don't authorize, all right? So weak organizations that authorize the use of force, every single one of them in our data attack civilians, right? And for reasons I've already described, that's not terribly surprising, right? I'd also say this isn't a very large group. There aren't a ton of organizations that meet this description. It gets a little bit more interesting as you move down to strong organizations that authorize, okay? Now you might sort of immediately ask, well, if they're strong and they say to do it, then why isn't this a 1? right off the bat. Why are they not always doing it? Okay. Part of the reason for this, I think, is that it's sort of an interesting extension of the logic, but that just because they say we might authorize the use of force under some circumstances or against these particular types of targets, civilian targets, doesn't mean the gloves are off, strategic restraint is gone, wholesale slaughter, go for it, guys, right? If you've got strong leadership that's doing this, they still often might be showing a certain amount of restraint, right? Very particular targets. And so the end result of that is that you see it in a common way, but given that this is yearly data, you're not seeing it every year, okay? They're doing it sporadically. As you move down to weak organizations that don't authorize, there's a decline, but it's not statistically significant. As you move down to strong organizations that don't authorize, you're way down, right? So that means that these organizations are targeting civilians 15% of the time, and the key comparison is strong organizations that do authorize are doing it nearly half the time.
Bill, I know we can interrupt, and I apologize, I'm only doing it because I'll forget to ask this.
Do it. I really don't.
So, when I'm looking at the state level controls, I was curious why you didn't, or actually I should ask why, if you thought about controlling for the number of other groups in the country. And here's why. So, I started thinking that if you are competing with a lot of other militant groups, right, you could imagine that that would increase violence that would appear indiscriminate, right, but you're really, say, competing over
right.
Factions of the populace are killing each other, and it looks indiscriminate. But that could also kind of depress our observations of centralized leadership, right, because you're really undermining each other's organization.
Right.
So have you thought about?
We have. So this is one of those really unsatisfying answers so we do that, and it's in an appendix to the paper. It got pulled from the main body of the paper because, so this is closely related to Bloom's whole outbidding idea, right? That these organizations are in this process of perhaps escalating violence, civilian targeting in particular, to prove that they are sort of the prime organization in the theater, right? We ran into a reviewer that was offended by that logic, and so it got exiled. But the end result is actually, we don't find a ton of support for it, right? Which is partially why we didn't get too upset about that getting into the appendix. This sort of shines through fully when you control for number of organizations. We also coded out a variable on interorganizational competition, right? So whether they're actually like really doing that, and again, you still get this same result. So I think what's happening here is that these are both parts of the story. Like, I don't think the Bloom outbidding thesis is wrong. I think that it's just happening in parallel to this, so it isn't really confounding this particular relationship. Any other questions while we're stopped?
Yeah, sorry, since we're stopped, Bill. You've alluded to this a little bit, but I wonder, had you thought about including more explicitly as an explanatory variable the ideological agenda of the militant groups? Because it seems to me like the ones that have a more globalized, universal, eschatological one like Al-Qaeda core might be very different than ones like Hamas, which have more of a territorial one.
Right. So there's some of that, right? The ones that you're seeing in these particular models are just those religious and ethno-nationalist ones. The existing data on that is pretty rough in terms of the categories that it's putting people into. The key thing about this is, you can leave Al-Qaeda and its close affiliates out of here as well. Because Al-Qaeda, as you know perfectly well, is a very unusual organization. Right? When you're doing this kind of analysis, I would basically say that any findings you have here don't generalize to Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda isn't driving these findings, okay? Because they're just thrown into a pool with 100 other organizations, particularly given the time frame, right? Because you're sort of pre-Al-Qaeda fracturing into a ton of other outfits, right? There just aren't not a lot of other examples of organizations with that motivational structure, right? The sort of global jihad thing was an innovation, right? So again, it limits what you can say about, in some ways, the organization that policymakers care most about, but I think it speaks to the more general underlying phenomenon. Any others?
I'm sorry if I missed this, but for clarification, what counts as an attack here?
So this is any civilian getting killed. Okay, so this does not include failed attacks, right? Because we're worried about civilian targeting, and we're worried about the data. We do have data on failed attacks, and we run it that way. It gets pretty fuzzy, actually. I think a lot of that is because the data on failed attacks is not nearly as good as the data on effective attacks, right? So this is actually limited to attacks in which at least one person was killed.
Just real quick, besides generic measures of state capacity, what exactly do you have in there to capture how the state will respond to the group after an attack occurs?
So
this is a strategic interaction, right? So I
Right.
rely on the group and not allow the state response.
Well, so what we have in here is basically measures of executive control and state power, right? There is not anything in here about, in sort of a tit-for-tat way, particularly in a time series way, about what the state's response is. We also don't have anything in here for lack of data on specifically counterterrorism capabilities. So yeah, I think that's a fair critique. All right. So one concern that we had here was that we're operating with the caveat that we've gone back and tried to recode a lot of these data and make sure that we agree with them and think they're right and cross-reference them with other data sets. We're still operating within the confines of sort of a single data set here, all right, for the Marok tests. And so in order to sort of make this look a little bit more robust, or hopefully be a little bit more robust, not just make it look a little more robust, we sort of looked for other factors that we thought might be associated with a loss of principal control, aside from these direct measures of leadership centralization, okay? And so specifically, we looked at whether organizations were open or clandestine, and two measures of whether they're operating over international boundaries. And the ideas here being simply that, obviously, if you're operating in secret, communication is a lot more curtailed, your control is going to be a lot weaker, at least that's our expectation. And that no matter what your leadership structure looks like, if you're operating over an international boundary, that makes it a lot harder to control what people are doing on the other side of that divide. Okay? And interestingly, these ideas kind of re-emerge when we move to the test on Afghanistan and Pakistan, because it has this cool attribute where the leadership is mostly in Pakistan, and the attacks that we care about are happening in Afghanistan. Okay, so this particular concern is going to re-emerge. And I don't want to go through the details of that, but this is in fact kind of what we expect to see, right? So I kind of crammed these together so you can see them, but this is the probability of civilian targeting on all of these axes. And as you move from a secret to an open organization, that as expected declines, and then these two measures of operating across borders, you see a substantial increase, all right? Okay, so as I said, there are issues in that test. It's the most general one we have, and therefore it allows us to say, okay, maybe we're seeing something that is in fact an attribute of all organizations of this sort, but we've got this chunky yearly data, we're inside a single data set, we've got big endogeneity concerns, and so we moved into a more micro treatment where we looked at the ongoing UAV campaign on sort of a combination of Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and Haqqani network leadership operating in tribal Pakistan, right? And so the way we're thinking about this is that these drone strikes, and we sort of checked with a lot of the policymakers who are very uncomfortable talking about these issues, but they sort of confirmed a little bit with sideways nods of the head, that kind of thing. But that, these could be properly thought of as kind of external exogenous treatments on leadership structure, okay? And the way I want you to think about that is that once underway, this campaign is more or less sort of full throttle, right? So as targets emerge, opportunities are generally taken, right? From the perspective of the leadership, right? So the key thing here is that it's the perspective of the leadership that matters more than the perspective of the US policymakers, okay? And so the end result of that is that they're not really able to calibrate what they're doing in prior expectation of this treatment on their leadership structure. And then I think importantly as well, you're in a context where substantial control problems are already in play, okay? These are organizations that are under enormous pressure. By definition, there's an ongoing campaign against them. Their leadership's been structurally decimated. And therefore, it's reasonable to expect that these relatively minor treatments on leadership structure might be enough to sort of cause perceptible effects, okay? The other thing that's really nice about this is that the data we have, the pressure on leadership in the form of these strikes, and the data on targeting choices, it varies in a much finer grained way. All right, so we know the actual date of these attacks. We know the actual dates of, and by the initial attacks, I mean the UAV strikes. We know the actual dates and targets in play in Afghanistan. Okay. The one thing I would say about this, obviously, is that the data is coming from secondary sources. Right? So it's coming primarily on the UAV side from Pakistani newspapers. You can imagine some potential concerns with that, right? Although, given the particular nature of the newspapers in question here, as well as the fact that it's been cross-verified from a number of other sources to check the validity where possible, the data comes from the New America Foundation, by the way. You know, we're reasonably confident that this isn't completely garbage data. We think this is pretty good data. All right. Okay. Two things we expect to see here. One of which is pretty intuitive, the other which maybe is a little bit less so. Okay. The first of these is that operationally successful UAV strikes are going to be positively associated with indiscriminate attacks. Okay, attacks against civilians. I should also say that when we're doing this, we're looking at the combination of coalition forces, Afghan police, and Afghan government as the sort of hard targets, and we're looking at civilian targets as the soft targets. Okay, so we explore the relationship with both. Operationally successful as in leaders were killed in that strike. Okay, perhaps less intuitively, I think the actual strike density is going to be associated with indiscriminate attacks as well. Right? And the reason for that is, as soon as these things happen, the available evidence suggests that the immediate response from these organizations is to scatter and become paranoid, right? The question is, who in this room said that we were here, right? Who snitched? What's the story? Why are they on to us? All that sort of thing, okay? The end result is that they scatter to the winds, they cut off lines of communication, they become very defensively oriented, and therefore, for the expected effect on command and control, they're effectively dead, right? At least for a short period of time, okay? And that short period of time is sort of a key point here. Okay, so unlike the other tests where we had a lot of concerns about confounding variables, change over time, that sort of thing, here we can do a much more elegant empirical strategy, outcome, civilian targeting and military targeting. I already told you what that distinction was. And the explanatory variables are simply strikes, leaders killed, and lagged over time, okay, with fixed effects to sort of wash out the things that we don't care about, okay? We've played with some other covariates at different points in time, but haven't had found much need for them, okay? And so just to give you a sense of what this looks like, and then we can move on to questions and hopefully have a conversation about this with the extra time. I'll talk a little bit about the Al-Aqsa case too. So what I've done here is I've combined the two types of tests, right? So on the left-hand side, you have predicted attacks on civilian targets, so civilian being the key there. Number of strikes, so this is the strike density measure, not the leaders killed measure, which are not as correlated as you would think they are. And as the number of strikes increases, the attacks on civilian targets increases as well. Okay, you get a similar pattern with leaders killed here too, though. Okay, they're mixed just to show you the sort of diversity of measures. Predicted attacks on military targets, leaders killed, increases. Attacks on predicted attacks on military targets declines. Okay, so again, this is basically what we're expecting to find here, given this story. Now, when I've talked to DoD people about this, you sort of get this response that's along the lines of, well, you know, I don't love the normative implications of this, but this looks pretty good, right? The express purpose of this thing is to decrease attacks on coalition forces, right? That seems to be happening. And if the inadvertent consequence of that we hadn't anticipated is that they lash out and kill a bunch of civilians, that's not so bad either, right? I think it's a really interesting sort of thing to tease out. One thing I would say is that there's a whole part of that story that is completely outside of our analysis, right, when you're thinking about this from sort of a cost-benefit standpoint. And that's the sort of blowback factor, right? So the question of the extent to which these strikes are engendering a lot of resentment on the part of the civilian population themselves. Okay, and there's a bunch of people who are doing work on that right now. There's a bunch of surveys that are in the field that I think are potentially going to shed a lot of light on that. But before you can use this as sort of a program evaluation on this campaign, you really need that additional piece of information. Okay. All right, so then in order to tease out this mechanism a little bit more, we turned to a more detailed case study of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. I'm going to kind of cruise through this because we don't really have the time to get into that in a ton of detail, but there were sort of 4 key points that we wanted to make, all right, once we sort of had worked through this case. And this is that brigade leadership consistently favored selective violence. All right, so the leadership preference was in favor of selective violence. That targeted selection became less discriminate as the Intifada unfolded, okay? And that this diminished target selectivity was due to a loss of principal control, right? So we can actually sort of look into this particular case and really tie these 2 things together in a way that we're not able to in the empirical tests, all right? And that finally, while it was the leadership that recognized that attacks on civilians were politically counterproductive, it was the lower level members of the organization that did sort of pursue these tactics, and sort of for the very reasons that we discussed in the theory section of this paper, all right? So just to give you a sense of how leadership was weighing in on this question, this is the brigade chief. I am the Fatah movement, to which I belong, strongly oppose attacks and the targeting of civilians inside of Israel, our future neighbor, right? Hassan Kadar says, when they realize there are no civilian casualties and only soldiers dying in foreign land, it'll spark the change we need on the Israeli street to bring an end to the occupation, okay? Interestingly, you can see this sort of sentiment filtering through the organization. So here's the Bethlehem regional commander: harming Israeli civilians is completely unacceptable. Strategy is to fight settlement and settlers by attacking Israeli military posts. Now I should say, in their view, the settlers were not civilians. Okay, so this, I'm not making the case that the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade was, handing out carnations until they lost strategic control. It's that they were able to execute the mission that they wanted to be executed. Okay, Ramallah regional commander sort of is in lockstep with the party line. I'm against touching civilians, though strongly supportive of hitting the IDF and other instruments of the occupation. And then key, this isn't just strategic, right? It's not that they're just saying these things because they're concerned about blowback from the United States in response to what they're saying or something like that, because their actions are generally matching their words, all right? So through this period of strong centralized control, you have targeted attacks on the IDF in Haifa, Hebron, Tel Aviv, all places where there would have been options for much softer targets, obviously, right? And civilians are sort of consciously off limits in this period. Now what happens is the Israelis decide that they want to crack down on Al-Aqsa, and specifically that they're going to do that by degrading leadership. Okay, and that's sort of going to be their direct approach to this. And so the IDF successfully kills and captures dozens of brigade commanders, and this culminates in the arrest of the head of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. And what happens then is that the nature of the organization changes. Okay, so we're able to sort of track this into the actual organizational structure of the brigades, and outside observers sort of easily pick this up. The network is diffuse, fragmented, localized, and does not take orders from leaders of the organization. Military elements responsible for the terrorist attacks are not under the control of the political leadership because there's no infrastructure, just small groups making their own decisions. Okay, so sort of precisely what we're talking about here. And the direct implication of that is a change in target. Okay. At the outset, the brigade expressly targeted Israeli settlers and security forces. However, the group soon expanded its targets to include citizens in Israeli cities. Council on Foreign Relations says, while the group initially vowed to target only Israeli soldiers and settlers, in 2002 it joined in a spree of terrorist attacks against civilians. And the end result of this was what they've been trying to fight off the whole time, right? Which was getting listed by the State Department as a terror. I mean, it wasn't the only thing they were worried about, but there was a lot of reticence inside of the United States about how to deal with this organization, right? Because they were worried it would undermine negotiations. It's the militant wing of Fatah. You don't want to label them a terrorist organization. All of the political responses that come automatically with that, if it's going to undermine the peace process. You start doing stuff like this listing is inevitable, right? So you suffer sort of strategic losses directly as a result of this loss of principal control and the targeting choices that come along with it. Okay, so in conclusion, what I want to argue is that it really is, at least in large part, this lack of principal control that contributes to indiscriminate violence. And the end result of that is that we can develop a story in which indiscriminate violence is perfectly rational. We don't have to resort to sort of throwing up our hands and saying these people are a bunch of crazies, right? So it can be perfectly rational, it just depends on who's in charge, right? It's whose rationality are we talking about? And in a lot of ways, I think we've been assuming that we were talking about leadership with political goals, and therefore, if it didn't work politically, it couldn't be rational. And it's a lot more complicated than that, because these are not, in fact, unitary actors, right? And so I think from a strategic standpoint, the result is that terrorism isn't a puzzle, right? It's a logical consequence of organizational breakdown. And so when we're thinking about terrorism and counterterrorism, it's pretty important to think about both the nature of the organization you're dealing with at the outset and the implications of your policy response to it for the eventual organizational structure. Right? So you, as an outsider, potentially have some control over organizational breakdown. Traditionally, we've thought of that as a pretty good thing to go after. It may well be, but there is this additional implication of it. All right, so with that, I'll answer some